Human culture thrives when discussions about what is true, what is just, and what is beautiful is remembered as an ongoing, never-ending, never-complete conversation.
To quote Milton, by the known rules of ancient liberty, welcome to Risky Conversations. I am your co-host, Enver Sadat. Join me and my co-host, Ace Deliri, as we engage in this ancient tradition of discussions around interesting topics with utterly fascinating people.
Welcome to Risky Conversations, Velina. Please introduce yourself to our audience.
Hello, my name is Velina Tchakarova. I live in Vienna, Austria, but I'm originally from Bulgaria, and actually it's an interesting profile because I am a German alumni, have studied in a German high school and German university, and I've been living in Austria for the last 13 years as an Austrian citizen, so I actually wear all these three leverages in me, and I, of course, am also proud European. Well, I'm not going to say make Europe great again. However, I'm a proud European, so it's all of this is actually me. And thank you guys for having me this evening.
So we want to start with the most obvious question right now. How is Europe reacting to coronavirus right now? Besides what you hear on the news and the chatter you see on Twitter, we want to hear from somebody who's literally living in that area, and she can tell us a bit more firsthand experience of what's going on.
Well, welcome to my hell, so to say, because I've been following all the events from day one. I've been following them not only because of my professional background, as I am actually covering, global trends and trends that are relevant for political processes, specifically for Europe. So I've been following all the events from day one, starting in China. I've been following also all the work done by Nassim Taleb, John Norman, so all the complex system team and what they have been producing. I've been trying to alarm the political decision makers here in Austria long before there was even a case one here in Austria. Now we are at 66 cases and we are bordering Italy, that's literally facing already, a devastating situation in the northern parts, with many areas being already under quarantine and, traveling blockade and all the full program that we've witnessed in China a month and almost 2 months actually ago, right? So it's painful to watch because on the one side, I personally saw it coming here in Europe. And then there is no serious, the principle that's being applied here by political elites and, institutions, because we have a very complex process here in Europe. We don't have only the member states, but we have also European Union, so we have also institutional approach. They come together, they discuss, they negotiate, they come up with a common position whatsoever. So the problem is that the principle that they've agreed on was more or less a principle of an appropriate response. So waiting till, the situation deteriorates and then reacting to a situation, which of course is detrimental to the precautionary principle that has been introduced by Taleb's team, right? So I have to point to their work. I mean, for those who want to learn more about it, everything has been outlined in the last 2 months, and there is a detrimental difference between these two approaches, if you like, because in my sense, if you are going to apply this principle of appropriate response in a situation of pandemic, once this pandemic is here it's already too late to react to it. So it's actually, it's a reactive approach that's not really helpful, and that's my pain. That's why I said, welcome to my hell, because I've been, just to give you an example, 3 weeks ago we have been discussing these matters, and we didn't have a single case, confirmed case here in Austria. And I was like, guys, be prepared for having a similar situation, not in the same scale, of course, as in Wuhan, but of course, similar situation. And, having people who are panicking about it because they don't know how to react to it, this is a very human reaction, once you see that the virus is spreading. And no politician would actually bring it under control, no matter how many statements are being produced daily, right? Because people then, exactly. So, and now we are here, we are bordering Italy. Each day we get more and more cases. Of course, there are some differences in the member states' approaches. Some countries try to be more cautious. Italy is certainly unfortunately, the case where we see how late they were in their response and what the consequences are, basically. Right. So, I'm devastated, to be honest, on a personal level, but also on professional level, because I've been trying to ring some bells about it. And it was all about, we don't need too much panic. We don't need overreaction. We don't need, too much precautionary, actions in advance. That was more or less the response.
Right. See, that's the thing that makes that process interesting is because I can actually appreciate what their concerns are. And I mean it in the following sense, right? So on the individual level, the idea is it's better to prepare and be accused of panic than to panic because you weren't prepared later, right? So in that sense, it's much more prudent to save yourself and your family and your friends by saying, guys, look, I was telling Ember literally, I think it was 2 weeks ago, please go and buy all the stuff you'll need, the rice, the canned foods and all that stuff and water. And she was asking me, how much of the stuff did you buy? And when I kind of told her, I've stocked up a bunch, initially it kind of throws people off because they think, wow, you're overreacting. But now, a couple of weeks later, all of a sudden, they look at that situation and they have a different approach to it. And my argument with them is, look, what you think is overreaction may even still be underreaction because we don't know what we're dealing with. So in the face of that level of uncertainty, whatever you think is overreaction is also a false premise because you don't know what this virus actually is. You don't know its incubation period. You don't know its mortality rate. And people will point to these various stats saying, flu kills X number of people. So this is no different than just the flu. And then you have to remind them that, well, actually, this thing kills young people. The flu typically kills older people. So that tells you that it's a lot more potent. And as a consequence, it's much more important to be ready for it. But on the other hand, and this is just so that we can always be appreciative of the nuance that's required on this particular subject, you have governments who have tax bases that they need revenues from. And those tax bases are entirely predicated upon the economy not being disrupted. So now they're looking at it and they're doing a calculus in their head and they're thinking, well, if we tell people to panic or be worried and they stop going out, businesses are going to slumber and then we're going to have less revenue and then we're going to have a potential recession that we're going to bring on to ourselves in a self-fulfilling prophecy. We don't want to do that. But at the same time, if we don't worry about this and we overwhelm our medical system, and if this thing turns out to be as bad as it actually could be, and we're completely in the opposite direction because we're all running toward the cliff, we're going to be in trouble. And so I'll give you a couple examples. I have a couple of friends of mine who are from the islands in the Caribbean, and the entire islands there are predicated upon tourism. And their government cannot say anything because if they say anything and tourism drops by 20%, their entire economy is totally ravaged. So you kind of see the balance act that people have to perform. And in most cases, I try to look at it from the point of view of, I'm like, look, you're not totally stupid in the sense that you're worried about this thing being dangerous to your country because you're a particular leader of a country. You have multiple agendas to counterbalance, right? You also don't want to upset your trading partners. You have to walk a very tight rope. So for us, it's a little bit easier to say, hey, make decision X or make decision Y. because we have different values and we have different items on our agenda. For them, I'm not saying their decision is correct or incorrect. I'm saying we need to be fully aware of the context of the decisions they're making. Now, it seems as though it is accelerating in the other direction. Like you said, they're realizing that there's panic and there's worry. And there's an interesting side product that I've noticed, and it's countries where people greet each other with kisses on the cheeks. So the Italians, the French, the Persians, they're seeming to have a much more greater rate of transmission than the countries who typically don't have that warm level of greeting between people. So I'm starting to notice a couple of interesting trends here. But to your point, it's not easy to convince, because we come at it from a point of view of, like, it's like when me and Ember try to sell our business solutions from a software point of view to a company. They know going in we have an agenda. Obviously, we have an agenda, but their agenda and our agenda don't always line up. So what we think when we're pitching to them is that you're being short-sighted. In reality, is they're saying, yeah, I see the value of what you're saying, but it doesn't completely line up with my values. So you have to give it some time, and when those values line up, then they'll come around to the issue.
Well, it's also about, having a certain responsibility, because it's a pandemic. As you already mentioned, the unknowns are far too many as compared to what we actually know about this virus, right? 2 months later, we're still very much in the dark about the virus itself. The whole thing, how it started right from the start in December, was covered more or less, because it started in China, where we perfectly well know, that the government, did the best to save face right from the start. They lost at least a few weeks before they officially, made it aware, So
Right.
Basically, at least 3 weeks later, because like I said, I've been following this from day one, and it reminded me, quite much to another incident, even though that it was not of a similar proportion, or it was a natural disaster, or a hazard such as as a virus, as the coronavirus. However, it reminded me of another, a similar way of dealing with the situation during the Soviet time. And at that time I was 7 years old, and I remember very well how, when the Chernobyl incident occurred, the Chernobyl catastrophe in the Soviet Union, there was actually during that time, we know we didn't have internet and social media. However, the way how the communist government dealt with, this emergency right from the start was basically to cover it up. People were kept literally in the dark. And this was very similar in this situation, specifically in December and then in the beginning of January. And what I actually point out is that we lost precious time to react adequately, towards containing the virus, right?
Right.
Saving lives. And of course, I do understand that at the beginning the people at the epicenter of, in Wuhan, couldn't know exactly what they were dealing with. That's understandable. From looking back at the events in January, but still, all these, covering up of the situation, so that they save face, they don't, they come up strong. And I don't even think at the top level, I mean, actually, party leaders, activists from the party at local level, the local party members were trying, to keep it under radar, to keep a low profile of it, right? So this is how actually it started. The whole emergency was actually handled with deception, with cover-ups, I don't need to give you examples. There were some really great journalistic, articles already who actually more or less outlined the whole events in December and in January. But it was actually the whole emergency was handled with deception, with cover-ups, with this, controlling of the narrative. And then if I go back also to the first statements by the World Health Organization, and I have the screenshots, if you can recall, it was also very similar, don't panic, everything is under control, we are in a complete control of the situation. If you remember that, it's
of course,
we have it documented, and
yes.
Now if we compare the narrative 2 months later, it's very, it's completely different, right? So, you can sense the panic actually coming out from the institutions, okay? Which is also worrisome, okay? So, like you've pointed out, we actually still don't really know what we don't know about this virus, right. More or less. Okay, that is actually something that European elites have to deal with right now, and are not really. I've traveled last week to a conference in Prague, and there was really actually nothing that could give you an idea that we are in an emergency situation. And I have talked to many friends also traveling on business, because you have to think about it, that many people are still traveling because they have business trips and their companies are not canceling these business trips. So you have to do it. You don't have any choice. I have had a cancellation by a guest this Friday who decided to stay in Germany. So he didn't come to Vienna on my invitation. The other 3 guys came to Vienna, but he decided to stay at home. But still, because he actually was afraid that the university would not cover his costs in the case that, you have an outbreak, sudden outbreak, right? And you have to stay in Vienna because suddenly you are quarantined. But more or less, it's so interesting that you have actually, if you look at the distances, we are like few hours away between Italy and Austria, and the sense of emergency is a completely different one. Right, and moving from one capital to the next here in Europe, you have a completely different picture of what's going on. Okay?
Right.
That's still the case.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is I have friends who are in the airline industry, and I have other friends who are in the conferences and event booking type of. I have friends. It's weird. I have friends in almost every industry just because of the nature of my previous networking capacities. But what was interesting was they're telling me that the airlines are freaking out because people book flights way in advance, and they now know that people are not booking flights on the fly. Like, pardon the pun. They're not booking any flights right now, and so they're saying we're not going to give refunds because X, Y, and Z, because they know they're about to face a really bad downturn. So the people who bought tickets earlier are in a bad spot now because they're not going to get their refunds. The airlines know that if they issue refunds on top of the fact that they're no longer going to get fresh flights going out, some of them may not survive this particular event because you don't really know how long this is going to last. At the same time, conference holders, people who create conferences to have people fly in, those are paid in advance, and they're also not issuing refunds because they're claiming, hey, we went through the trouble of setting all this stuff up. We gave our deposit for the particular venue. The venue is not giving back our money, so we can't give you back your money. There's this chain reaction up and down the, in this particular instance, supply chain of how the whole events are organized. So everybody's put in a tight position because the people who paid money and are not going to be reimbursed figure, well, if I'm going to get burned, I may as well go. And the businesses who have taken these advance payments are also in a spot where they're not willing to eat the costs of giving out refunds because they also know going forward they're not going to have as much business and maybe have almost no business for this year. Because if you're in one of those businesses, if you're an airline executive right now, you have to stop and think about it from the point of view of two layers, right? The first layer is your own staff, your flight attendants, your pilots, they may your workers on the tarmac who clean the plane and who load and unload baggage. They may not want to come into work. So first you have that problem. Second of all, the people who are flying, your customers, may not want to come on your flight. So you have two layers where you can entirely destroy your business, because if you have costs due for the flights, for the planes that you bought, that have 15, 20-year leases, those payments are going to be still expected to be made. At the same time, your business just took a massive nosedive, pardon the pun yet again. So there's lots of complexity and nuance built into this. So what we try to do here is our personal stance, myself and Ember included and my family, is that we're taking this to assume the worst case scenario. We're preparing as such. We're encouraging people to think these things through. I had a pretty large argument with the family last night because there's a wedding that's been planned for the family this July. And I said to them, you may have to come to terms with the fact that you may have to cancel this wedding because people are flying in. And at the time when, we don't know what this is going to look like. And I'm being told, you're fear mongering and, it'll be fine by then. The summer's going to come and warm weather is going to kill this thing and all those other arguments. So I kind of know the thick of it all, right? I've sort of experienced what it's like to try to hold multiple positions and to give a nuanced perspective on it. So it's interesting to see how all this unfurls, because all the human values, all the human traits of greed, desire for specialness. I get invited to all sorts of conferences myself, and I always decline. But there's a layer to that, which is like, oh, it's fun. I get to travel the world and I get to do conferences, and some people just get a kick out of that. So you get to see all of those variables condensed down against the facts of you could potentially contract a disease that can kill you. What's your decisions making process telling you to do? Right, so it's fascinating to watch all that. And the question I wanted to ask you now is, since the Chinese and the Russians appear to be such close friends, as you stated in your multiple tweets, that the China-Bear connection, what's Russia's reaction to all of this? I haven't seen anything on the news about Russia and how they're dealing with coronavirus.
Well, they are actually taking quite a precautionary principle. They actually even ran the risk of deteriorating their relations with China, which are now at the kind of an unprecedented level of closeness, of approximation, if you like, coordination in various fields, and this probably will cause some, damage, at least in the field of, diplomacy, political links. There will be probably some kind of, backfiring on the side of China. The very fact that it didn't happen yet is just because the Chinese are preoccupied now with getting the situation under control, which I think, at least what we've seen from the last few days, is having a positive turn. It's not over, but at least we have now heard some good news coming out from Wuhan, with some hospitals being closed, and the numbers are at least the death rate and whatsoever is just now declining, which are really, it's really good news. Well, the Russians, they have actually waited at the beginning with the travel restrictions. This was basically, one of the signs of, friendship, the dragon bear, trying to be as friendly as possible with, specifically with this Chinese narrative, because as you remember, and I have to point it once again for the sake of truth, that the World Health Organization, if you remember.
I do.
Well, yes. Well, when they declared the coronavirus to be a public health emergency, this was a month ago. It was at the beginning of February. If you remember correctly, they actually tried to, convince people that that no travel restrictions whatsoever are needed, right?
Right, I remember.
So that was actually the case right from the start. We don't need trade restrictions. We don't need travel restrictions. Just keep it going, right? And this is, well, the Russian position at that time was in line with it, okay? So they really tried to stay as, to stick to it as long as possible. However, once they got their own cases, suspect cases whatsoever, they also introduced, some travel restrictions. So basically, for instance, in the main airports, for instance, in Moscow, they actually separated flights coming from China at a specific, part of the airport and whatsoever. So I think that, in times of a pandemic, each nation thinks of its, own, first and foremost, of its own survival. So there will be some, like I said, some political backfiring. Once this is over, yes, because the Russians also, introduced limitations to their trade and, traveling.
Right.
That's the situation right now.
I see. So, just for our listeners, would you mind just giving us a little bit more context into your background?
Okay, so my professional background. Okay, so I already gave you an idea about my, 4 layers of mentalities, European mentalities. When it comes to my professional background, I actually, studied international relations, political science, all these majors that Nassim Taleb loves so much next to psychology. When I attended actually the real world risk program last year in February, the first question was, is there anybody, coming from the political science background? That was the first question that he actually asked. And I was sitting in the first row. So, So I actually my academic background is political science, international relations. This is what I've studied for 7 years in Sofia, in the capital of Bulgaria, and then later on in Heidelberg in Germany. And during that time in my 20s, I was, very much into, and I'm still 20 years later, very much into global affairs, international relations, relations between major rivals, global, regional, actors, constellations, all of these things that really, really I found and still really find exciting. Well, the problem is that after spending 7 years at these universities, I didn't really get many answers to the questions I had. So I actually ended up with having even more questions as to the state of the global affairs, why certain processes and structures are the way they are. Okay, and this was the time, I have to say, also after the, first and foremost after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, I've witnessed that myself. I come from a, communist ruled country that was a satellite of the Soviet Union. So I've witnessed all of that. I can assure you that nobody literally really saw it happening when it comes to the people, ordinary people. And I mean, of course, 95% of the people in these, communist countries prior to the 90s, no one actually saw it happening. Okay. So, people were completely devastated. They just found it out on the television. I remember very, very, very well this evening when we were sitting, having dinner, and we saw on the television that there is a transition of power, and suddenly from one day to the next, the so-called communist elite, turned out to be a social democrat, to be social democrats or liberal democrats, choose whatever you like, it was just like, recoloring, okay? And all of these, and then in the 90s were really, really harsh for Eastern Europeans because of the transition processes. Basically, the whole economies were completely devastated, completely. You had like all these processes of, national economies who were basically more or less state-owned, turned into privatization processes with, all of the effects. I don't need to tell you about that. We had hyperinflation. I mean, if there is something demoralizing, next to war, you cannot compare a war with anything else, but the next demoralizing thing is actually to live in a hyperinflation. So this is really something that is just turns you out in a survival mode, and we've been through it for 2 years, and all this time I've still been living in Sofia. And after finishing, high school, I decided I want to learn more what is really going on, how these transformational processes being shaped actually, by whom actually, who are the real actors behind it. So this was the motivation. Well, like I said, 7 years later, I ended up with having more questions than, answers. I was very dissatisfied, for very obvious reasons that, Nasib Taleb has been pointing to them so many times. I don't want to, repeat it. We're having all this qualitative research, very linear, not being capable of predicting anything actually whatsoever. Like I gave the example with the collapse of the Soviet Union, case studies, you pick up all this bottom-up cases, and you have like case studies comparing apples with oranges or whatsoever, not giving you any idea about any complex processes. And this was actually the time, specifically after the collapse of the Soviet, of the unprecedented globalization, of unprecedented complexity of the global system, right? So I started being an more or less autodidact person, getting into physics, into biology, into complex systems. Then I also dived into this geopolitical and geoeconomic approach. I started learning more about international political economy. How is this nexus between economics and politics? Not having only the one or the other, but what is actually the nexus between them? And I started, this was the time when I already moved to Austria after finishing, the university in Heidelberg. And, my first job actually was at a non-profit organization. So in this non-profit organization, I started covering all this, on the one side, processes in Eastern Europe, and in this time we had like situations like the Georgian War 2008, later on the Ukrainian War 2014, the wider Black Sea area, which is this still a very, very complex geographic area between the Middle East, southern and eastern neighborhood of the European Union. You have Turkey, you have Russia, you have the member states of the European Union, you have the North African countries, you have the Middle Eastern countries. It's just so much. There are so many layers, so many layers. And then you have the Balkan countries, the southeastern European countries. It's just overwhelming. Okay, so this was the time when I started covering these processes, and then I was like, okay, but that's still not enough for me. It's still not. It's telling you something about specific layers like regional layers, but it's still there's still much more to it. Okay, and this is the time when I actually started covering next to it, global risks and systemic risks. So this was the time after 2007, 2008, when for the very first time, systemic risks became more or less prominent due to the financial crisis, due to the global financial crisis. And we had, the privilege, if you like, because we were and still are. I'm still in this institute. Meanwhile, I'm the head of the institute, been, the active head since 2018. So I underwent all the, internal, processes of starting as a research fellow, senior research fellow, ending up as the head of this small institute. It's a very small institute. We are all actually, I'm the oldest one there, so a bunch of young people, and we are more or less situated at the input side. If you look at the political processes of a country, name whenever you like, which country you like. If you look at these processes and structures as a box, we are based at the input side of this of this political box. So basically, we are trying to constantly produce research for them, to give them ideas. Just like I gave you the example with the coronavirus right at the beginning. So we are incorporated into this process, but we are not part of the bureaucracy or part of the political decision makers. That makes us more or less independent in our way of thinking. So because we don't have to follow strict bureaucratical or any other lines, party lines or whatsoever, agendas. The only thing that we have in mind, of course, is if we are to follow a certain process, what it means for Austria, what it means for Europe. That's always the question we have in mind. Okay, that's the only question that we actually follow. And yes, and this is how we've been incorporated also in this kind of scenario monitoring process by certain ministries, key ministries in Austria, where they wanted to invite also external, researchers, so that we can give them also this external picture. Because once you are part of the process, you don't tend to, you tend to be in a kind of a circle. Right? Do you understand what I don't know whether I can actually describe it very well, but sometimes what you lack is this, external perspective.
Right.
So,
Right.
Something like additional view of things because of this group thinking, because of the pressure of sticking to the rules, within the institution, because of the internal competition, and whatsoever, call it whenever you like. So this is how I've started covering all these global risks. I've been doing this horizontal screening of signals, strong, weak signals when it comes to the global system. What kind of risks are emerging of this connection within the main components of this global system, and what I mean is all the socioeconomic components, not the natural, not the ecosystems, So, and then of course, to make sense of the emerging global and regional structures, because we have so many different layers right now, and you see how this. Just pick a region, and I can immediately give you an idea of of actors constellations and interests constellations, and then you have like a global layer that's also influencing them, top down, and so on and so on. But just this is maybe this is probably the short wrap up of what I'm doing. Doing.
What's interesting about that, because as you're discussing it, me and Ember, we come from Afghanistan, so we have an experience of what it's like when the Soviet-style communist intrusion into normal life prevails. And we were lucky enough to escape that. But one of the interesting things that I started to pay attention to maybe about 12, 15 years ago was this idea that at a specific moment in history, once a nuclear bomb was discovered, and once, the the population started to grow post World War II, we had a different sort of a problem that sort of showed up. And this is where we have the trade-off between needs on one side and performance on the other. So it's sort of like how cell phones, they want to get faster, but they don't want to kill the battery life. Similarly, countries have this issue where they have a growing population, but they also need to make sure all those people have higher quality of life, which means competition gets started. And the businesses have problems in that sense, is that not everybody who works at a particular law firm can become a senior partner. Not everybody can become a professor at a university. So what you end up doing is you start to engage in 4 metrics that I started to notice about wealth transfer mechanisms, which is that, this idea of international free trade, that's just basically a cover for wealth transfer mechanisms from poor countries to the elites in more powerful countries. And what they do is to counterbalance that act is to pretend that, when there's a crisis, the middle class of country A, i.e. the United States or Canada or Europe, is going to send quote-unquote aid to the poor country in Africa or in China or Brazil, or pick a country where they're having some issues. And that's how the powerful structures maintain this semblance of, we're the good guys and we're helping out. Meanwhile, the businesses and the way they conduct those businesses and how lopsided those particular agreements tend to be is robbing those poor countries of their wealth. Not completely, obviously, but there's a layer of greed that's so deeply embedded into it that it's very easy to see. So you're noticing that there's these 4 mechanisms that are being put into place, which is immigration. Immigration is basically cheap labor, right? Nobody wants to do immigration because they feel good or they want to do with diversity. That's all that stuff that they sell to you. What they really want is they want cheap labor. Then you have the next mechanism, which is leverage in terms of financial resources. That's why all the banks are leveraged. Every single financial downturn is predicated upon this idea of maintaining this quote unquote picture of growth. And they do so by just constantly borrowing money. The third thing is this idea of transfer of mechanism through the internet vis-a-vis the knowledge base. So Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Facebook itself is actually like a second internet. For the vast majority of the people in the world who've just come online, Facebook is the internet for them. So you got these mechanisms of trade, you got banking, financial regulations and whatnot, you got immigration, and you got technology, and these are all basically being used and usurped as mechanisms for transferring wealth from every country possible to the ones in charge. So the reason I bring all that up for you is because you're seeing this from the point of view of giving input to these governments. They have to look at this and they have to analyze and assess the situation from the point of view of, we want better relations for our partners abroad. So i.e. if you are Bulgaria, you do want a nicer relationship with the rest of the world and the rest of Europe. But at the same time, the people who are your citizens are suffering enormously because of, like you said, hyperinflation. I remember back in the 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia, quote unquote, started to privatize some of their state-owned properties. There was a capital flight problem, which was that a lot of Western countries started to put a lot of money into it and to help people become independently capable of buying shares of those countries. And that's how you got the Russian oligarchs coming out, right? So there's this constant battle between the rent seekers and parasites. And I think that's an interesting take on this issue, because parasites actually is very relevant to what's going on today, is that if you look at it from a Darwinian point of view, the most efficient way to survive is to be a parasite, because you don't have to hunt, you don't have to kill, and you're not under attack. You're basically attached to a host and you're just sucking all the nutrients you need to stay alive, and you're maybe producing some good to that host that you're latched onto. So I'm starting to look at this from George Cooper's point of view, when he was talking about Darwinism being a form of competition of what's good relative to what's out there, not what's good as in what's the best solution. So when I hear you talk, the first question I ask is, when you sit across the table to give your input to these leaders who are trying to make decisions as your alternative perspective, are you getting a sense that you're talking to rent seekers and wealth transfer mechanisms, or are you getting a sense that there's some genuine good people who are trying to make decisions but their hands are tied and they're not really sure a way out of it is possible?
Well, that's actually I've spent 10 years in this business, right? I've been dealing with political decision makers for the last 10 years, and I read and it was an intentional decision because I really wanted to make a change, if you like. I mean, it might sound idealistical, but at the time I was still very young, right? So it was actually my deliberate choice to be in this process, but not as a party member of a party, following lines of, directives or whatsoever, but to be, more or less independent in my way of thinking, because that was always, my personal principle, to have a complete 100% freedom of thinking and of saying what I really mean, the way how I see it. So yes, of course, there are some authentic people in the process who are trying to make a change, to deliver, if you like. The problem that we have with developed economies, specifically with democratic systems, is a quite obvious one when it comes to political decision makers, and that is that these people want to win elections. That's all that matters to them. First and foremost, they always tend to think in 2 to 4 years time frame, nothing more than that. No decision that has a sustainable, impact in, like, let's say 10 years from now would be a matter of choice for a politician who knows that he's not going to win elections with it, So pick any issue which is not sexy, is not selling to the electorate. And there you go. And that's actually the most frustrating part, because they are in some way, in my eyes, for instance, because I'm going to say it very openly, as I have zero intentions to go into politics, exactly because of that, is that they are not authentic. They are not. Most of them, they are reading from some, prepared memos. They have not that they don't have their own thoughts, or their experience or knowledge or whatsoever. That's not the case. But they are mostly reading from their memos or prepared speeches, and that's the reason why they are so unauthentic. That's the reason why people don't buy what they are telling us, right? So it's a the agenda that they have, this 2 to 4 years agenda, is a very average one. You just pick from least bad options that might somehow affect your electability. That's the reality, okay? So of course you're right when you say, for instance, you've mentioned immigration. Immigration as a cheap labor, expanding to other regions, with your model of of enlargement whatsoever, call whatever geo-economic model, it's always the same idea. You have a flow of people moving from one spot to the other because they hope that they will get better conditions, working conditions, life standard, whatsoever. You just take Eastern Europe that has witnessed an exodus of people, even though that this region actually was not in a state of war, just as it was the case with the Balkans in the last 30 years. And you have a complete exodus of people, moving from the eastern parts of Europe to the western parts. I mean, even the case of Bulgaria. Bulgaria has lost millions of people without waging a war for a single day in the last 30 years. And is projected to have like 5 million people in just 20, 30 years from now. And it was at almost 10 million after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, these are obvious obvious systemic processes that we observe, of course. I mean, moving from and I am a perfect example for it as well, right? I actually moved. I always tend to say I'm not an economic immigrant. I'm actually a political one, because the corruption of this country was so overwhelming, in every possible social layer. It was just unbearable. You had only two options. Either you are part of this system and you just close your eyes and you're participating, or you are out of this system and you are a complete loser, because you have no choice of getting a good job, having a good life there, or whatsoever. These are the two options. You don't have any others still. Okay, so I think that what here is important when we talk about political elites, and this is where I will try to do my best to somehow impact the process in the next 10 years, is what actually Nassim Taleb already pointed out with his Principia Politica, right? With this huge, monumental, fundamental document that he is going to publish as a book, and that is to try to pressure and to discipline politicians bottom up, because it's obvious that it's not going to happen top down. It's obvious that they're not going to to change their behavior, right? So we, the citizens, need to find a way how to discipline them and to make them change in their behavior, because as you see, the problems have become too complex. This 2 to 4 years mode of solving problems not going to bring us anywhere, right? And
Right.
I think that this is where I see also my role. Like I said, in the next 10 years, I'm not going to spend another 10 years, in just doing the same what I've done the last 10 years. But I'm going to try to initiate a process with citizens to create awareness about the necessity to change behavior of politicians. We have to keep those in power constantly in check, right?
Right.
Right. So what's going on between Turkey and Poland? Is there a conflict on the horizon? It appears like Turkey appears to be trying to use immigration as a weapon.
Between Turkey and
Poland?
You mean it's more like actually it's more like Turkey and the European Union.
Okay.
And the migration card, so to say, is not a new political instrument. The European Union and Turkey have agreed on a kind of a deal in 2016, where Turkey actually promised to facilitate the necessary conditions for keeping the migrants and refugees coming from war zones on the Turkish soil, whereas the European Union promised to deliver 6 billion euro for these facilities.
Okay.
That was the deal for the last, let's say, for the period between 2016 and 2019. Now we are once again in the situation of, so to say, renegotiating this deal. There is indeed actually a meeting, set for tomorrow between the European Union, member states, institutions or representatives, and the Turkish government, so that they will meet and will try to agree on new conditions. Of course, on the side of Turkey, they now see themselves in the strong position because they have already opened the border And according to their minister, of internal affairs, more than 100,000 refugees already left one of their, control points at the border.
Okay.
Moving towards Greece and mostly Greece and Bulgaria. And because there is, there are quite many tensions between Greece and Turkey already for various reasons, not only because of the refugee issue. They know that putting stress on Greece right now is a way how they can actually stress out the European Union as well. I mean, the European Union decision makers.
Do you think that Greece feels that the Europeans have abandoned them?
No. That actually, in fact, the most member states have not only announced their solidarity. Some of them, including Austria, sent governmental members to Greece to express their solidarity. They offered also, financial funding for their refugee programs and to facilitate the newly coming refugees on the Greek islands. Also on the side of the European Union institutions, they have been also very supportive. So actually, they are more or less behind Greece, of course. It's external European Union border. Contrary to Bulgaria, which is also European Union border, but it's not part of the Schengen. And Schengen is actually this, system that is in charge of controlling the European Union, so-called European Union borders. Okay. So they've been quite supportive on both institutional and member states level. The thing here is that you have this triangle between Russia, Turkey, and the European Union. And it's, on the one side, you have this rapprochement between Russia and Turkey when it comes to their overlapping interests. They have, Turkey wants to get the Russian S-400 system. They have agreed on getting more gas from Russia. That just last month, a new pipeline was opened, the Turk Stream, and then they have also some economic and trade interests. So there is a kind of a quite solid fundament for a rapprochement. On the other side, of course, we are observing what is going on in Syria, where they have detrimental interests, right? So there is also quite a conflictual ground for these two actors. And then you have the European Union on the other side. The European Union doesn't want to participate in war zones and conflicts like in the Middle East. They want to stay away. On the other side, of course, they have to provide some, financial means. Because staying outside of war zones right in front of your door means that you have to make some, you have some obligations, right? So it's very complicated at the moment. But I suppose that this issue won't be settled tomorrow or in the next month. The Turkish government will be using the card, of the refugees. They have like more than 4 million refugees right now, in their camps on the Turkish soil. So it's always going to be a leverage for them in their, in their bilateral relations with the European Union.
So here's an interesting question to pose to somebody with your background and knowledge and experience. So we remember the Ottoman Empire. So they have this particular pride in their history. Obviously, you have the Chinese who were, up until literally 2 months ago, were under this impression that the 21st century was going to be China's century. Now that's kind of put in a little bit of doubt. Then you have the Russians, which after the Soviet collapse, there really is no path for them in that regard for their old glory in terms of their pride. But they do have the most nuclear weapons, if I'm not mistaken, behind the U.S. or ahead of the U.S., one of those two arguments. So what's the relationship really like for how Russia sees itself relative to the world and for how Russia sees itself as a partner / potential enemy of the Chinese, given that they obviously don't want to, be in a world where the Chinese dictate terms to them, because they were not really big fans of having the Americans dictate terms to them. So how do you see all of that?
Well, that's that's a very, very good question. I mean, one that I've been dealing with for the last decade, and it's really interesting to follow that. On the one side, I mean, like you pointed out, you have a country that has been one of the two major systemic poles of the world. I mean, has been determining the international relations in every possible field, for how long? 50, 60 years. And then suddenly from one day to the next, without a war, completely collapsing. There was this quote by the Russian president that the collapse of the Soviet Union has been the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 21st century, right? And that was not said without a reason. It's hard to part yourself from mentally, if you like, for these political elites to get rid of the idea that you actually are no longer that systemic power. And to be fair, Russia, yes, is still, of course, a nuclear, global nuclear power. But when it comes to all the, the key factors that are necessary for projection of power in the world, in the global affairs, they can be. Right now, we have only two systemic rivals, two systemic competitors. We have still one country in the world, whether someone likes it or not. That's a different matter. I'm not giving an assessment whether this is a good thing or a bad thing or whatsoever. I'm not interested in all these normative assessments. I'm just pointing out to the reality that there is one country that still possesses or has actually the means for global power projection, and that is the United States. On the other side, we have a rising power. We still don't know whether China will be in the situation of becoming a second systemic pole, right? We still don't know that. We have an unprecedented economic and trade projection power on the side of the Chinese. Just to give you a very simple example, because we talked about the coronavirus at the beginning, and if we recall the last situation in 2003, if I'm not wrong, when we had the SARS outbreak, well, at that time, China had like 4% of the global outcome. Right now, with the coronavirus coming out from China is already having 17 to 18% of the global outcome, right? That's a completely different situation. So China is on its path of becoming probably a second systemic pole. That means, of course, not only economic and trade power projection, that means growing defense budget, that means more military capabilities, diplomatic leverage. We've seen that already. I don't need to give you the example also with the World Health Organization, where we know that at the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak, part of the problem with controlling the narrative, don't panic narrative, was also because of China, right? So the Chinese have already leveraged in diplomatic, in international regional organizations. They have launched their own regional organizations as well. So they're trying also to build their own alternative set of organizations and institutions where they can actually shape relations the way how they, from their perspective. And then there is also, of course, other layers that are such as culture, diplomacy, political affairs, and all the other issues. So when it comes to Russia, I think that the interesting part is here is that they still very much try to use every opportunity to be on, so to say, to act as this global power, to give you an example with the nuclear weapons. For instance, they tried also to negotiate with the North, with North Korea, so that they also have still some international regimes and relations. So when it comes to the nuclear non-proliferation with the United States, on the other side, they are, in my sense, regional power that has not longer have any significant share in the global financial, economic, and trade outcome. So that is the reality. It's, so to say, a free rider, a country that is trying now to basically play its cards the best way they can. They know that none of the two systemic powers, so that means neither United States nor China, wants to see Russia as being part of the other bloc, because that becomes problematic. And that's also the reason why we witnessed in the last years during the Trump's, mandate, a sort of, at least at diplomatic level, in his language, a sort of approximation with the Russian, opening a door to them, even though that nothing really happened, nothing serious came out of this. And on the other side, we also witnessed this unprecedented coordination of efforts of, policies in different fields between China and Russia. This unprecedented friendship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and they are trying to position themselves, so to say, between these two powers, but also to balance them, and also, of course, when it comes to the direct geographical area where they are actually active, they're trying to build a kind of a vertical axis of presence, of Russian presence, of networks, starting with the Arctic, in the north, then along the so-called eastern flank of the European Union. These are former Soviet Union members, such as the Baltics, such as the Eastern European countries. Then along the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, going through these territories, then, Black Sea, like I said, the Black Sea area, the Balkans, Middle East now with Syria, and then the Mediterranean Sea, and now even reaching out to North Africa, where they are also having their, presence and network. So this is actually their regional projection of power, if you like. Okay, this is actually where they really see themselves being present for the sake of their national interests, for the sake of their geoeconomic interests, if you like. This is where I see Russia.
Right. So what's interesting in that front is, from where I sit in Canada, where we're looking at this, we live in sort of unprecedented times, and I mean that in the following sense. So you have two people on Earth, Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi, who are single person, supposedly representing 1 billion people. I mean, the scale of that asymmetry is astronomically mind-boggling, because that's absurd. Then you have 4 or 5 guys. You got Tim Cook, you got Jeff Bezos, you got Sundar Pichai, you got Satya Nadella, who are in essence head of $1 trillion companies. Companies that are not really necessarily bound nationally to any particular region. And then you have the Russians. And the reason I look at the Russians in that regard is I sort of see them in a way where Putin's primary objective is essentially to maintain control over power and to hand down that position of power to whoever he decides to pass it on to afterwards. Because like you said, aside from the nuclear weapons that they have, which I imagine the cost of maintaining those things and the cost of making sure that they can still quote unquote fire them if they have to is substantially high. It's not like it's just sitting there, everything is good. I'm sure it costs them billions of dollars a year just to maintain it. But their economy hasn't been producing anything outside of selling natural resources. And once those natural resources have been accommodated for, because we're starting to see other countries reducing their reliance, because I remember back in Obama's period when they had this quote unquote reset relations with Russia going, the Russians were really charging the Germans a lot of money for the natural gas during the winter times to heat the regions up. So I'm starting to see that area of it, and I'm starting to say that Putin's angle appears, and again, this is purely conjecture and speculation on my part. Nobody take this into anything other than just a thought to ruminate over, is that Russia's just basically playing their time out so that the guy in charge can stay in charge and pass it down to whoever he sees, because opportunities for him in this 21st century are going to be opportunities based on financial capabilities and economic power. And I don't see anything coming from them that indicates that they're ready for that shift. Whereas for China's problem, I think that's one of those cases where the appearances, it's kind of like that neighbor you have. And I'm reminded of, I think it was Hemingway's quote, which is like, how do you go bankrupt slowly but then suddenly, is that you have this country with this appearance to the outside world of projecting power and calm and stability, and then something like Corona shows up, and all of a sudden you see that, that neighbor, their family looks really happy, but there's actually a lot of abuse going on, and in one day it could just kind of blow out the door, right? So you can kind of see it sort of collapsing on it, whereas the people think they have this false assumption that because of the level of political vitriol that you see on Twitter with regards to the United States, that the United States is actually crumbling, which actually it looks like it's the opposite, because if they're willing to disengage with each other at that level and be that vitriolic in public, at least whatever problems are internal are going to be addressed in a much more effective manner than when you have a country where Xi Jinping is now leader for life. So these particular angles, and you also have the Chinese problem of how are you going to give 1 billion people the kind of lifestyle that they all want, which is sort of more westernized and European in nature. The amount of resources you'd have to consume and the amount of growth you'd have to be able to sustain is clearly going to be beyond measure for them, and they're going to have to come to terms with that really, really soon. If they were maybe 300 million big instead of 1 billion, then I could make the argument for them, but I don't know. I don't see it myself. But what's your take on it? Given the fact that they have 1 billion people, can they really actually ever become a quote-unquote tentpole in the opposite direction of the U.S. while maintaining social stability and harmony at home?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's actually a question that only time can tell whether we will witness it or not. I mean, that kind of predictions, if somebody can tell you that he or she, I mean, that they can give you a prediction about it, I mean, they're really lying. But I will try to do my best, based on my observations, to give you a picture the way how I see the things about China. Let me say some words about Russia, because you said something that is really important about this shift that has never happened, right? So they had lost 30 years of opportunities to restructure the economy on the Russian side, I mean, and it's still basically very much the same networks operating in the country with, with a Russian president who is basically the balancer between these networks, so that they don't turn against each other. And
right.
We have some some really huge companies, like you've pointed out. Natural resources is still very much the case for the Russian economy. There is also a growing not yet interdependence, but Russia is also now turning into a supplier for China, when it comes to energy. But yes, on the other side, also the interdependence between European Union, so basically the European Union member states, and specifically you mentioned Germany and Russian supplies is also growing, which is ridiculous, because that's at least my personal opinion, because instead of trying to diversify your energy portfolio so that you actually cut these dependencies, because at some point it might turn against your interests to be so dependent on only one supplier. This kind of interdependence is even growing now. Okay, that's about Russia. And now, of course, like I said, with a Russian president who has the main function of being a balancer between all these conflictual networks within the country, with a very different background and with, very strong interests to control. If we remove this balancer, they basically will, start waging wars between themselves, so to say, conflicts, having conflicts. And that's the reason also why he's now launched this process with, with the new constitution, with the constitutional reform. So basically, I think that he's going to try to somehow, make it possible for him to somehow be part of the process after the end of his mandate in 2024. That's about Russia. So now moving to the more questionable future of China, because there are two different layers here. On the one side, because I'm someone who is always looking at the helicopter view of the processes and structures, there is now indeed this kind of decoupling process that has begun with the election of Trump. It is not just about trade dispute. So this kind of trade deal that has been negotiated, the phase one trade deal, is just one of the layers. We are talking about a systemic decoupling, which means that, this kind of introduction of China into the networks that have been launched by the United States during the decades after the Second World War, specifically after the 70s, when China was, incorporated into these networks, which eventually led to this unprecedented economic power and trade power that China has become. There is now this trend of decoupling China from these networks. Okay, this is the one thing. So what I am observing is that there might be two scenarios. On the one side, of course, no U.S. president is, eternal, and we might witness another election of Trump. But there might be also the case of, the Democrats having a candidate who, beats Trump at the election campaign, if we have elections, because then, of course, we have the coronavirus now, and the outbreak of the corona might also lead to Trump being beaten by himself. I mean, based on the way how he reacts to the coronavirus. Okay, so if Trump would be re-elected, I would expect that this decoupling trend continues. And I mean not only trade, I mean also economic decoupling. I mean also, decoupling from institutional decoupling. U.S. on the one side is withdrawing from some international organizations where China has now quite great leverage. On the other side, it's about energy, like I've pointed out. I mean, China is in that matter dependent on supplies from external actors. United States, on the other side, has managed a kind of a shift in the field of energy, is now more or less reliant on supplies. That's really something that has to be pointed out. I mean, that's unprecedented, as seen from the last decades. And this decoupling means also that China will be probably moving towards consumption-oriented economy, right? Because so far it has been an export-oriented economy. So being a consumption-oriented economy means, of course, that China will be focusing on this trend that you've pointed out with the growing population. Growing population means also, of course, growing middle class, more people. And it's not just about, several thousands. It's about millions of people having more means, to consume, for consumption. So actually, that's probably the opportunity that China sees, how to make the shift, in terms of economy, by launching this consumption-oriented economic model, and by reacting to the demographics, also to the demographics. So one of the two regions in the world that will really witness huge demographic growth, is actually Asia, next to Africa. So, of course, on the other side, we know the problems of China when it comes to the demographic, development. I think that, the coronavirus isn't over yet, even though that Xi Jinping has now managed this, the most serious, phase of dealing with the coronavirus politically. I mean, he survived politically. I don't think that he will politically survive the repercussions coming out from the disruption of the supply chains, of the economic trade systems that are now to happen. Right? If you've pointed it out right at the beginning of the conversation. So I will be looking at how Xi Jinping actually will react to this, to these processes, and how actually he will survive this. If he survives this, right? I think that next what will come is, internally a sort of strengthening of another centralization of political power, if you like, using the opportunity to get rid of some political opponents, and more or less becoming even more, more focused with yourself, inwards and outwards. Like I said, inwards because it's all about facilitating this political power. Outwards, it's all about how China is now going to manage its own networks with allies, partners, friendly states in Asia and beyond. And that's the reason why actually this kind of regional projects, expansionist projects such as the Belt and Road Initiative, and all the other, accompanying platforms, banks that they have launched that are very, similar to the ones that have been launched by the United States, are now in place, trying to get other countries into this Chinese model of economic and trade relations. So to say, to sum it up, two uncertainties. One is the Xi Jinping surviving the coronavirus and the disruption, and the other uncertainty is about the decoupling between United States and China.
As the old members of the Soviet state have joined Europe and their new project, have they really noticed any benefits of sort of aligning with the Europe that's really not necessarily integrating them as first-class citizens? Because I have some friends who are from particular areas, and they always talk to me in the following sense. They say, listen, when we were part of the Soviets, we were useful, quote-unquote, idiots for them. We knew that because, it was forced satellite communism, as you stated earlier. But now that we're trying to join the Europeans, they don't treat us as like one of the Europeans. They treat us sort of like second-class citizens. So the question I really had for you, because this is one of my friends who asked me, is: are the former satellites of Soviet Union, are they enjoying their relationship with Europe now? Are they getting any benefits from it? Are they still worried about what's going on, given the fact that Brexit happened, and given the fact that if Germany decides to pull out and say, listen, we're done, we can't fund this particular initiative anymore? What's the sense on the Eastern Bloc side of how all this is unfolding?
Okay, that's a really good question. I've been talking to many friends as well, and I have a family still, in Eastern Europe, and I'm traveling, through all these Eastern European countries. I'm visiting them constantly. Of course, we cannot deny there is a kind of a dividing line between, the core of the European Union, the old Europe, the Western Europe, European member states, if you like, and then the newcomers, right? The Eastern European ones. Right. There is this dividing line, but this dividing line has also many layers. Okay, on the one side, if you ask any of these political elites, anybody from these political elites, would you join, another regional organization such as the Soviet Union-led ones during the time of the Cold War? I mean, the question, the answer is always no, right? I mean, if you see how certain ideologies such as Marxism are now being revived, and not only at universities and not only by certain political leaders, even here in Europe, but also in the United States. Eastern European countries are done with it. Of course, you will have some people still, still into it, but most, the majority are done with it. Okay. Right. That's one, for instance, one major difference. Now with the increasing influence coming from China, for instance, investments, political links, business relations, loans, CE platforms. This is like they have, for instance, the Chinese have a special platform for the Central and the Eastern European countries that's called 17 plus 1. That means 17 former Soviet Union satellites and countries from the region, starting from Central and Eastern Europe, are now part of this platform for relations with China. Right. And then you have, of course, Russia, still very, very active, has revived some of the old networks, very active when it comes to political links to some parties, specifically when it comes, to more, parties more on the extreme sides, on the left or on the right. So all of this is nothing new, but the majority of the population in these countries is very, very much pro-European, even though that they still keep, being unsatisfied about this or that. There is even the joke, we have this joke coming from Bulgaria, that Bulgaria was the last country to join the Soviet Union. And finally, when they joined the Soviet Union and the family, of the satellites, the Soviet Union collapsed. And now Bulgaria is also one of those, the last countries to join the European Union. And the danger is now, since Bulgaria joined the European Union will collapse.
Right, bad timing.
You have all this, bashing on the side, on the side of population. But the truth is that the Eastern European population, the majority, is very much pro-European. Very, very much pro-European, and they still have a lot of benefits. And these people, specifically, older generations, they remember, they have the memory of how it was. Even my generation still has the memory of how it was before. And you have so many benefits. I can give you thousands of examples. What I've been through in the 90s, even when it came to traveling within Europe, right? How hard it was actually to travel even within Europe, even though that wall was already removed, the Berlin Wall was removed, the Soviet Union was no longer there, and it still was very, very hard for us to travel from one country to the other. And all of this was gone once the country, joined the European. So there are a lot of benefits. I mean, specifically the younger generations, they don't know, they have never been through it. They don't have any idea about what it means because they freely move everywhere. And basically, that's the one thing, okay? The bashing is there,
Right.
yes, but I cannot imagine that the majority of the population in the Eastern European parts will actually ever like to join another Soviet-style union or whatsoever, or alliance or whatsoever. I mean, no, zero. I can assure you of that. Where the problems come are probably about lack of participation. Sometimes there is this feeling, second-class societies, they are not so much part of the, of the institutions, of shaping the institutions. When, when you have, for instance, a reshuffle, institutional reshuffle, like now we have a new commission, we have a new parliament, we have new, personalities also in charge of the European Union institutions. There is this feeling that Eastern Europeans are not, are often not on the list, not in the running, not in charge. But I think that also this will change. It just will take some time, but it will change as well. And then there is, of course, the migration crisis from, 2015 that also added another dividing line because, most of the pressure was more or less taken by the Eastern European countries and, Southeastern European countries in the Balkans, countries that were completely overwhelmed financially, economically, in terms of infrastructure, because it was not just a matter of preparation, it was just a matter of capabilities, lacking capabilities to, to cope with such a situation, having so many people, have to facilitate ad hoc all of the necessary, conditions for them. And, and most of the pressure was taken by these countries. That, of course, unleashed some centrifugal forces within, political forces within the countries. That's correct. Some of this kind of, ad hoc forces also tried to capitalize on elections. That's also correct. But the last elections, for instance, for European Parliament and in most of these countries also show that, there is still very much, especially in the younger population, there is still very much this expectation that they want a pro-European policies. They want actually also pro-European parties actually gain more votes. Okay, so there will be the trend, by the way, specifically here in Central Europe, being led by countries such as Austria. Austria is a medium-sized country, surrounded by Central European countries, such as Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary. These are the so-called Visegrad countries. And then, building bridges to the Western Balkans and to Baltics, to Eastern Europe, to kind of build new groups of new alliances, if you like, so that they can coordinate certain policies. Like, for instance, these countries are very much pro-enlargement. They want that Western Balkans join the European Union because they are convinced that if Western Balkan countries join the European Union, some of these conflicts will be settled, within the new borders, so to say. So, for instance, they are very much in favor of North Macedonia or Albania getting along, becoming getting the opportunity also to start a process of enlargement. And I think this is also another dividing line because last statements by leading politicians from countries like Germany and France were very, very cautious about it. They are now in a, at a different stage, so to say. They have to settle the issues after Brexit. I mean, there is going to be a kind of a competition also between France and Germany as to which of these two countries will going to shape the processes when it comes to, the interests of continental Europeans. And there will be certainly some competition also between the UK and the European Union during the process of, negotiating a new deal between them. And I think that in this matter, the next layer that will be decisive is, of course, the United States. United States is being perceived differently, once again, on the west side and on the east side. The Eastern European countries still perceive, the governments and majority of the population still perceive the United States as the sole guarantor of their security, which is very interesting because they perceive the European Union as a very big economic and trade power. And it's good for them to be part of this trading and economic power. But on the other side, when it comes to their security, it's still very much about the United States first and foremost, which, of course, if we look in the capitals in Western Europe, European members like Germany or, France or Spain, there are more, the discussions that are being held there is more about strategic autonomy, how to get more, more independent, to become more independent from United States in the field of defense, in the field of, security and so on. So different, you see how many different layers and how
Of
many
course.
different how the discussions about the same matter are being held in a different manner.
Of course.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do China and Russia see the American alliance with India getting stronger?
Well, that's one of the things that I'm really, really very excited about this upcoming US-India relationship. On the one side, I saw it as an inevitable development due to this approximation between China and Russia, but specifically due to the rapprochement between China and Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
So there will be, in my sense, an effort on the side of the US government, no matter who the next president will be, to approach India, to try to deepen relations not only in the field of trade, economic ties, cultural ties, but also to try to build up, a relation when it comes to defense cooperation. This is going to be hard because Russia, for instance, has been a traditionally good strategic partner to India already from the time during the Cold War and afterwards as well. So Russia has been also trying to mediate between China and India. China-India relationship is a very, very difficult one. These are two natural rivals. These are two countries that are not just neighbors, neighbors being natural rivals. On the other side, China and Russia are also neighbors, direct neighbors and natural rivals. However, the difference here is that China has been trying to engage all direct India's neighbors into a kind of a strategy of deepening relations, offering loans, deepening relations in many areas, offering loans, trying to increase a direct presence on the ground, and India perceives this strategy as a kind of encirclement. Okay, this is actually the way how the Indian political elite sees it. There is going to be also the issue over food, water. There are many conflictual areas there. On the other side, like I said, Pakistan, the direct rival in this in the South Asian region, where the two countries have waged wars against each other. They had many military conflicts, and they have also nuclear weapons, is now basically in the orbit of Chinese influence. China is building a comprehensive economic corridor, is trying, to influence politics, is having military presence, if you like. I mean, that's under the, it's actually laid out as securing Chinese investments on the ground. But there is an increasing engagement on the side of Beijing in Pakistan. So as you can see, Russia on the one side has been trying to mediate between China and India. There are many different platforms for that matter. Take the so-called BRICS platform. These are the countries Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Okay. Then they have also launched some, actually 2 banks on the side of China with participation of these countries in order to facilitate investments in the region. Then, of course, there have been different regional forums where also Russia has been trying to somehow, bring these 2 countries together, at least in the field of, political links. There is, for instance, a trilateral format between the foreign ministers of China, Russia, and India. Okay, so there are some platforms where these 3 can meet and can discuss, hot topics. On the other side, like I said, for India, in the long term, it's going to be important to have a stable, reliable partner that can also provide for, the geopolitical interests of India. And right now, it's really interesting to see how the previous ally of Pakistan, United States, is now on its way to become, India's friend due to these changing constellations. So I'm expecting a kind of this visit by Trump in India was just part, of series of new measures and meetings and engagements between these countries due to the constellations that I've outlined for you.
Okay, perfect. So how much coordination and cooperation does China and Russia engage in? And how do they deal with Pakistan as their ally, given their Muslim extremist problem in both countries?
Yes. So the thing about this, I called it the dragon bear, this kind of coordination. I called it back in 2015. I called it the dragon bear in order to point to a new mode of systemic coordination and to find out whether there is really something new to this. Was it an ad hoc, or was it just an ad hoc event or development due to new realities in the global affairs, or was it really something more systemic, something more long-term? So first and foremost, it's important to understand that it's not an alliance in the sense how we understand alliances, based on shared values or, overlapping comprehensive interests. Mm-hmm. That's the first thing. So it's actually a mode of systemic, this is at least how I call it, a mode of systemic coordination between these 2 countries in various fields and in several geographic areas, while they are still natural rivals and they are still, having also conflictual interests in other areas and in other, fields of policy. So that's the other thing. So it's a kind of, if you like, interim mode of coordination between these 2 as a matter of convenience, which of course is, on the one side, due to this global system transformation, On the other side, due to the need, to be so to say, to build an alternative model to the US-led one. So, of course, the most strategic goal of any of this coordination is how to react to US-led policies or to US-led, organizations, institutions in any of the fields. That has to be comprehended. That it's, of course, about also an asymmetric, cooperation, if you like, because right now the country that has the leverage is China. The country that has the liquidity, if you like, the country that can provide for liquidity, for projects or whatsoever, is China. But what Russia can offer, of course, is, in certain areas, not only the experience from the Cold War, it's not only about, the nuclear weapons that it still has, and developing new defense technologies that might be, useful and interesting for China, but also about, specifically about certain technologies and certain areas where there can be certain interdependence. One area I already mentioned is the energy sector, because China, as a growing economic power, is hungry for natural resources, and Russia can provide these resources. Of course, Russia is not the only supplier. China has a very diversified portfolio, but the share of Russian supply is, has the tendency of growing. So energy, of course, is one of these. Certainly one of these key areas. You mentioned also, defense, the defense sector, military cooperation is certainly on the trend of rising. I mean, there is indeed already several developments that point to this tendency. There are trials, exercises being organized by these two countries.
Okay.
There is also a regional cooperation called, under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where they also discuss not only defense cooperation and military cooperation, but they also discuss anti-terror operations. They have the two countries have also other partners, such as the Central Asian countries, and they have some, they have invited some countries as observer, with an observer mode. This Shanghai Cooperation Organizations, for instance, is one platform, regional platform, where none of the so-called West is nobody from the so-called West is being part of, and they are discussing issues, of and defense matters. Then there is, of course, the issue of trade and economy, which is also having the tendency of rising. That means also they are deepening the relations in the field of trade, in the field of economic ties, in the field of financial matters. They are trying, for instance, China has provided or basically we can say that it actually saved the Russian currency. The last time when it has been facing a really, really tough time, that was in 2015, was basically, saved by the Chinese. And yes, and then there is the field of agriculture, because China, as we know, needs a lot of imports, food imports. So Russia is also one of the sources for them to provide for different agricultural products, and technological scientific cooperation is, of course, also to be mentioned. New technologies, now is the discussion about, for instance, 5G. Huawei, and the Russian government has no problem with, introducing Huawei 5G network, to Russia. There are, of course, new technologies such as artificial intelligence, capabilities, or the new internet. Yes.
Wait. Yeah. Hold on. That. How does Russia not mind the Chinese providing them Huawei into their infrastructure? Isn't that just like a complete and utter subjugation of their potential capabilities for intelligence by letting the Chinese have a backdoor?
Well, they have a sort of kind of a cooperation in the cyber field, and they are even the Russians want to introduce even their own internet. At least that's the plan. I mean, between plan and reality, you can never know exactly where they are in the process, right? Yes, but at least on the political level, it's very important to understand that this kind of, dragon bear coordination is very much being shaped by the highest ranking, level of political elite. So it's a very personal relationship between, the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping. That's the first layer. It's very highly coordinated. It has to be understood that it's really very highly coordinated. That means that probably a very closed circle, a very, very close circle on both sides is being part of this process of coordination when it comes to the, political decisions, what to do. So probably, I would not take a decision such as the one to introduce the Huawei 5G to Russia as, I would take it as a preliminary, political statement. I wouldn't expect that it's going to happen tomorrow or, next year, but it is a strong signal, right? That's actually my point.
Right.
We should not take it for granted. We should not actually take it as something that is reality until it happens. However, what is really interesting is this kind of readiness, to open new, chapters and to explore. And that is actually something that's, on my side, worrisome, because we don't really know exactly what is going on behind the curtains. We don't have so much information about it. There is no really kind of transparent process about what is really going on, what is really coordinated, how much, what is the scale. So I'm just outlining for you some of these layers, some of these processes, some of these structures, if you like, but it doesn't mean anything. That's the point. We should look at it. We should consider it, but it says nothing about, the final outcome. And and that's why I think that specifically this kind of scientific coordination and cooperation in this, when it comes to these new technologies, is quite a new terrain, terra nova, if you like, because because there are so many options there to be explored, and we know on the Chinese side that they are quite advanced already in some of these technologies. They have been testing them on their own population, right? So, and they have been already, testing them also on third countries, for example, in Africa. So I don't know whether there is this interest on the side of the Russian government to introduce something, when it comes to their own population. We know that we talked about it previously. There is no serious economic shift has been actually achieved in the last 30 years. The demographic development in Russia isn't really positive one. to put it mildly. And there is always this case of how to react to kind of protests coming from the population and whatsoever. So we don't know exactly what they have in mind, and the proposal of having on internet, to the couple from the internet network, if you like, to have your own internet, points to something like, let's have an own internet, let's have an own, technology about everything.
Right.
Let's isolate ourselves from, from US-led technologies. This is how I see it.
Right. Well, we appreciate your vast and deep sources of knowledge and experience within this area. We appreciate you taking the time to share it with us. Is there anything left that you want to go over?
Well, I think that we've touched upon many issues.
Yes, thank you for that.
So I actually have to thank you for the patience with me, because I love talking, so.
No, we loved it. There was so much good stuff to digest.
Yeah. It's certainly, we just scratched on the surface regarding all these issues. And for those who would be interested in learning more about all of these topics, they can always visit our Twitter accounts and can engage there. And I really thank you for having me this evening, and for all your comments also, and really great insights that you provided during the conversation.
Thank you. You're welcome anytime you want to come back and share your insights into the evolving situation of what's happening in Europe and Russia and China. So please feel free whenever you want to come back and discuss other topics, just let us know. We'll make the accommodations. And in the meantime, we will link to your Twitter account and to your institute and all the good stuff that people can find there. Did you have any books that you want to recommend for our listeners?
Well, I have a book list. I'd love to provide, those who are interested with it. There is not a single book about these issues. You basically have to cover many different areas. So those who want to get more information, they can write me. I have my direct messages open to everyone, and I'm trying to respond to everyone, actually.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us, Velina.
My only book recommendation is, of course, to read the Insertu by Nassim Taleb. That's the only recommendation I will make.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.
We hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we have. The truth is, any conversation worthy of having will inherently be a risky one.
Thank you for listening. Stay anti-fragile and carry on the ancient tradition and your own unique way of saying what only you can say and doing what only you can do. Abiding by Milton's words, this is Ember Sadat and Ace Deliri signing off, wishing you the very best of worthy and risky conversations.